Welcome to this module on climate change and society. My name is Parthasarathi. I have a primary affiliation with the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Bombay, where I am a professor. My basic training is in social sciences, especially sociology, but most of my research and teaching in the last couple of decades has been in the areas of climate change, disasters, public policy, development studies and urban studies, and so you see my affiliations there, the associate affiliations with climate studies, policy studies and urban science and engineering. In this module, we are going to focus on the social dynamics that are unleashed by climate change impacts. We are also going to look at how society responds to climate change impacts in the form of adaptation, mitigation. So, the cultural and political dimensions of both the impacts as well as the response is something that we are going to learn about. In the process, we are also going to learn something about how various social science academic disciplines have responded to the study of climate change, to climate change imperatives, but also in turn how these disciplines themselves have transformed and evolved in order to address the challenges of climate change, because this requires new kinds of knowledge, new kinds of skills, new kinds of methodologies, and therefore, the epistemological aspects of climate change on these new disciplines is something very exciting for us to learn about, and hopefully this will make all of you look at your own disciplines in a very different way and make the teaching of the subjects in your disciplines much more challenging. Before we begin, let me give you a brief introduction about myself. So, here I present some of the major research projects related to climate change that I have been involved in. Of course, my area of research spans beyond climate change into other areas as well, but I am focusing only on climate change here. So, I have been involved since the year 2002 in India's national communication to UNFCCC. So, the third one is going on right now, and our focus has been on vulnerability and adaptation, especially in coastal areas, but more recently we are also looking at livelihood impacts, especially in forestry, fisheries and agriculture. I was also involved in some capacity building on climate change negotiations. We worked with the basic countries, that is Brazil, India, South Africa and China, and as part of that we also developed a range of tools to assess vulnerability and adaptation and trained a number of government officials in these countries on this. We have been working with a number of agencies of the government of Maharashtra, especially on issues related to flooding and extreme rainfall events, and more recently trying to understand the uncertainty that is such an essential part of climate science. So, how do scientists understand climate change and uncertainty? How do bureaucrats and government officials respond to the uncertainties unleashed by climate change? And how do ordinary people and communities understand and deal with climate uncertainty? So, this is a project that we just completed, and as a follow up to this we are now trying to find out how various communities in 3 different locations in India are actually responding to these uncertainties by coming up with alternative strategies of managing their lives and livelihoods better in responding to climate change. These are some of the areas in which some of my PhD students have worked on climate change. As you can see, it covers a gamut of areas across adaptive capacity, climate warning and communication, the impact of variability. As you know, monsoon variability is already a notorious problem for agriculture especially. So, how does climate change transform the already existing variability, and in what sense does it lead to enhanced forms of vulnerability in different sectors, but especially agriculture. There is also a new buzzword in climate change, where we are trying to go beyond adaptation to think of transformation. That is, we need complete or holistic transformation of society, of the economy, of technology, of governance in order to address climate change related uncertainty. So, philosophers are referring to uncertainty deriving from climate change as a monster problem or as a wicked problem. So, small scale adaptive changes are no longer seen as adequate to deal with these kind of problems, and so we need complete transformation of society to address these. These are the areas I work on. The first 4 are areas I used to work on in the initial 5-6 years of my research interest in climate change: risk and vulnerability, coastal vulnerability, and vulnerability to flooding. In the last few years, I have been working more on disaster governance related to extreme climate risks, climate uncertainty as a theoretical object of research, but also from an empirical perspective, and also on climate justice. And the issue of transformation, what kind of transformation is required, what kind of transformation is happening with reference to climate change, is something that I am also working on in the last few years. Let me give you a brief outline of this module, and then we will move on to the topics that I plan to cover in this particular module on climate change and society. So, we start by looking at social sciences and social science disciplines and how these have engaged with climate change. The particular focus is on sociology and anthropology, but I also bring in from time to time other disciplines such as political science, history, geography, and policy studies. One of the things that we see when we try to find out how social sciences have addressed the challenges of knowledge posed by climate change, we see that there are different paradigms within social sciences that have tried to engage with the knowledge challenges posed by climate change. But what we also see is that there is a mutual reciprocal influence or impact. That is, climate change has transformed social science disciplines like sociology and anthropology to come up with new paradigms, new concepts, new theories, and new methodologies, and we will talk about some of these in more detail a little later. Also, it is not just research in these disciplines that has been transformed. Climate change has posed a challenge to how these disciplines are to be taught in the classroom, what kind of textbooks are required, how do we make the new generations of students understand the challenges of climate change across different disciplines, across different sub-disciplines of these subjects. But more importantly, keeping in mind the transdisciplinary focus of this particular course, various social science disciplines have been forced to cross disciplines and learn from other disciplines, so that they can then perform their own pedagogic and research tasks better. So, in that sense, this module is about epistemology as well as ontology. That is, it is about what kind of concepts and theories, what kind of knowledge within social science disciplines are useful to understand climate change and to help human society adapt better to climate change and become more resilient. At the same time, the actual lived experiences of human beings in the context of climate change and the risks they pose, the hazards. So, this module is also about epistemology and ontology. So, we are interested in the kind of concepts and theories that social science disciplines have had to come up with or transform existing concepts and theories in order to understand climate change better and help human societies come up with better adaptive strategies and coping mechanisms. At the same time, these disciplines also have to deal with ontology, that is, the lived experiences of individuals and collectives who have to deal with various kinds of climate risks and hazards, whether these are super cyclones, sea level rise, coastal erosion, heat waves, or increasing frequency of droughts. So, compared to earlier kinds of studies on the environment, for example, what new methodologies, what new challenges are do these kinds of ontologies pose? That is, the lived experiences of human societies under anthropogenic climate change. How do we capture these both empirically and theoretically? How do we interpret the kind of experiences that human beings are going through? So, these are very exciting times actually for various social science disciplines in addressing these kinds of challenges. We are going to study also the relationship between climate and culture. So, culture is one of the key concepts of disciplines like sociology and anthropology, and culture, as many of you who are from these disciplines will know, is a very broad concept. So, what aspects of culture interface with climate change, in what way, why and how? So, the mutual influences, how climate impacts modify different kinds of cultural aspects and behavior, and how cultural dimensions of society in turn either hinder or enable human societies to address the challenges posed by climate change. Finally, we are going to focus on politics of climate change. So, most of us are familiar with the politics related to international negotiations on climate change, but beyond the negotiations and the politics involved in them, we are going to take one step backward and try and understand what are the political factors related to inequality or fairness or justice or poverty or developmental challenges. So, what kind of political issues do these raise in coming into in setting up agreements to deal with climate change, to mitigate emissions, for example? What kind of political factors operate in either ensuring that governments do an efficient job in addressing climate change challenges, in putting in place mitigation targets, or in putting in place efficient adaptation mechanisms? Or on the other hand, why is it that some governments either completely deny the risks posed by climate change, or despite knowing the risks, do nothing? So, some of these are related to the uncertainties in climate science itself, but also we are going to look at some forms of ignorance, the different forms of ignorance, and how these in fact create their own politics around climate change. So, these are also cultural issues, because these come from different kinds of values that human beings have and human societies have. These relate to institutions and norms, and these relate to the various kinds of interactions that human beings have with each other. These relate to what kind of meanings we fix on climate change related problems. So, these are the main topics that we are going to cover in this module, and we will take them up one by one, starting with the next slide. Now, initially scholars, researchers, teachers working on climate change, they identified two broad paradigms in trying to understand the impacts of climate change and the problems related to how vulnerable human societies are to climate change, and what kind of adaptation strategies are required to cope with climate change related problems. So, the social sciences essentially looked at vulnerability and adaptation to climate change as representing a set of factors, socioeconomic factors, that would influence people's ability to cope with these kinds of cope with the stresses and shocks deriving from climate change. Whereas, within climate science, vulnerability was identified or defined in terms of the likelihood of occurrence and impacts, and the possible impacts, the potential impacts of weather and climate related events. Eventually, these have merged into combined and integrated definitions of vulnerability and adaptation. Our focus here is on trying to understand vulnerability from what is referred to as the adaptation aspect of vulnerability. That is, what characteristics of an individual or a group or a society or a collective, what characteristics define their capacity to anticipate the future impacts of climate change, to cope with both current and future impacts, to resist these impacts and to recover from them. So, here we are identifying social vulnerability to climate change as one determinant of a larger set of vulnerabilities, which could be environmental, which could be atmospheric, which could come from specific kinds of hazards. But we are saying that specific socio-economic factors like poverty or inequality or health or social status, these are likely to determine how vulnerable they are, or they are not to certain kinds of climate risks, to certain kinds of hazards. So, even though many of us who have been teaching these disciplines subjects for a long time may not be aware of the contribution of these disciplines in understanding vulnerability to climate risks, there has been quite a bit of research since the 1980s especially, but much more in the last couple of decades. I have oriented this particular part to a discussion of climate risks and social impacts to countries like India in particular and to developing countries in general, because there are certain unique aspects which we need to keep in mind from a social cultural perspective, which help us to both understand climate risks better and help us to design better strategies to adapt to climate change. So, take for example, societies like ours which have a history of discrimination or exclusion based on collective identities or social status or ethnicity, religion, language, region, caste and so on. So, in such cases we see that vulnerability is not just a simple exposure to climate hazards or risks. Vulnerability also arises from a failure to address risk adequately because of one's own social location and status. So, these are things that one could bring up in the classroom when we talk of the cultural dimensions of vulnerability in countries like India. So, what we are saying here is that risks arise not just from a deprivation of material things like poverty, from a lack of ability to understand cyclone warnings for example, or from the inability to access cyclone shelters. So, it is not just a question of just distribution, but risk itself is socially constructed in such a way that there are certain groups, certain communities who are excluded from risk, and this we see not just in India, but increasingly in so called developed countries like the US. So, the recent events in Puerto Rico tell us about how issues of inequality play a very important role in how the state helps out or fails to help communities in times of need. So, the choice to help people, the attitude of the state towards its own citizens, these are determined by the status that people enjoy, the social attitudes of the rest of the society towards them, their location, social location in terms of caste or religion or region or language or ethnicity. So, here you see a very clear example of ideologies and cultural attitudes shaping how we deal with risk, and there are plenty of studies in India not just to do with climate risk, but with other kinds of disasters, earthquakes for example, which bring out these factors very well, and there are a number of studies which you could use in the classroom to explain these. So, the contribution of sociology or anthropology to this particular debate has been to highlight what some other social science disciplines like economics has taken for granted. That is, we are not just saying that the market or the state can enable societies to effectively deal with challenges posed by climate hazards. We are saying that there are fundamental problems related to social inequalities, social attitudes, to issues of discrimination, which need to be addressed, because these can interfere even where the state and the market plays a very efficient role in addressing problems of risk. So, we are saying that whether these are state institutions, these are NGOs, these are community bodies, their positions on risk are influenced by who they are, their identity, whether they are upper caste or lower caste, which religion they belong to, what has been their experience of risks and dealing with risks, and their orientation to other communities who are affected by climate hazards. So, here one of the pioneering sociologists who has dealt with climate change and disasters for almost 30 years now, Tierney, she talks about how vulnerability to hazards is not uniform across all groups. So, there may be a particular location or a region which is affected by droughts or a cyclone. So, all communities, all individuals are not affected equally in the same way. So, contextual factors related to power or social status or poverty or age or disability or gender, these determine who are vulnerable in exactly what way to different kinds of climate hazards. So, this is a key insight that social science disciplines have brought in to understand vulnerability to climate change. Another key problem that has been identified, and this is something that I have done research on as well, is that in developing countries there is an accumulation of risks. So, communities, populations, individuals are constantly facing a barrage of different kinds of risks. So, people may be poor, there may be a threat of discrimination, there may be a threat of violence. In addition, there may be environmental risks, climate change risks, and populations are put in this unfortunate situation where they have to choose between different types of risks. So, given a risk of unemployment, given a risk of violence, they may choose to go with a risk of climate change hazards, which are uncertain and which may be in the distant future, but which may also happen tomorrow. So, when populations choose between different risks, over a period of time they accumulate a series of risks which derive from, as I show in this slide, inequality, various kinds of social division, discriminatory practices on the basis of caste or religion or gender, and therefore, they put themselves in certain situations where they are more vulnerable to climate hazards than other populations. Okay. So, this is something that I have referred to as prismatic vulnerability in some of my work. So, how inequality or certain kinds of social and cultural factors refract hazards and risks to result in particular kinds of outcomes. So, rather than adopt a uniform kind of approach about the impacts of climate in our classrooms or in our research, in the kind of activities we make our students do, what we can do is to try and discern or distinguish between the different kinds of impacts that different communities or men and women or elderly and children experience when it comes to climate related hazards. And you see that if you take examples from what has been happening recently in heat waves in Europe or the floods and extreme rainfall events and heat waves in Japan, you will clearly see that there is a pattern that different kinds of people are affected differently. Some groups like the elderly and children are affected more than others, the people with disability are affected more than others. So, identifying these differences is a crucial cultural dimension that we can bring into the classroom, and eventually these can help design much more refined and robust adaptation strategies when it comes to climate change hazards. What we see is that in many developing countries, there is a lack of awareness of the spatial distribution of risk. So, the spatial distribution of risk is not simply in terms of where climate hazards happen. It is not simply a question of which parts of the country cyclones tend to occur or which are affected by droughts or sea level rise. It is also a question of which sections of the vulnerable populations are located in those areas which are most exposed to climate change hazards. Once we are able to do this, we get a much better understanding of vulnerability, and therefore, which sections of the population and where they are located need to be helped out in terms of adapting to climate change. So, all of these help us to produce a more robust sociological understanding of what kind of institutions are required for addressing climate change challenges. These institutions could be state institutions as well as non-state agencies. Also, they help us to go beyond narrow technocratic or technocentric approaches, which may work in the short term, but may end up creating more risks in the long term for vulnerable populations. So, the key questions that a social science understanding of climate change enables us to ask are listed here in this particular slide. So, a lot of international agencies tend to transfer approaches on risk and vulnerability derived from the Western context to countries in Asia or Africa or South America or Southeast Asia. So, a sociological or anthropological approach, a focus on cultural context, helps us to ask questions about whether these approaches will actually work here, or do we have to design new approaches, or do we have to modify and revise those approaches to fit our kind of contexts. So, what happens is, based on certain so called universally applicable criteria, a state may say that it is prepared to deal with a climate risk, but when the risk actually eventualizes, we find that the state is not prepared, nor is society prepared, because we have failed to consider the many different local contextual factors that are required to make a society be well prepared to deal with a disaster. Also, in countries like India, you have a constant flow of migrant populations across cities or between rural and urban areas. So, for example, some studies in Mumbai have shown that it is very difficult to conduct drills and prepare people to deal with floods, because populations are constantly moving across different parts of the city or between rural and urban areas. So, in such contexts, how do you create awareness? How do you build knowledge on preparedness? How do you enable people to deal with climate risks such as extreme rainfall events? Okay. So, whether it is knowledge about the onset of certain climate hazards, whether it is the impacts of climate related disasters, whether it is the strategies for preventing adverse impacts, mitigation, rehabilitation, all of these require that at every stage of disaster governance related to climate change, we need to incorporate these dimensions of inequality, hierarchies, divisions, exclusions, discrimination, the specific contextual factors of our societies, so that we can come up with more robust ways of both understanding and dealing with the requirements of effective disaster governance. I am going to now take you into more specific kinds of discussions about how disciplines like sociology and anthropology can enhance our understanding of climate issues through the broad concept of culture. Now, those in the social sciences and humanities will know that culture is not simply to do with the arts, it is not simply to do with literature or music or painting. Culture refers at the very broad level to a certain way of life or ways of life. Culture incorporates things all the way from food to technology to knowledge to education. So, every single mechanism or strategy that human beings deploy on an everyday basis in dealing with the environment, in dealing with society, in deciding how to govern themselves, in addressing various kinds of problems that people face on an everyday basis. So, culture is a holistic kind of concept that helps us to understand the different ways of life which encompass everything from technology to food to music to literature and knowledge and education. Now, disciplines like anthropology have a very long tradition of over a century of studying society environment interactions. So, this is an advantage that disciplines like sociology and anthropology bring to the climate change field, because the environment has not been regarded as something distinct that is to be studied separately by environmental specialists. So, the interaction between society and environment has always been regarded as important for studying various things, whether you want to study kinship or caste or democracy, whether we want to study economic behavior or finance, technologies. Everything has been studied using this lens of society environment interactions. What climate change has done is to sensitize these disciplines to design appropriate adaptation and mitigation strategies by not only using the strengths of our own disciplines, but going beyond these disciplines and using transdisciplinary approaches. That is, what can sociology or anthropology learn by, for example, understanding how ecologists deal with climate change, how civil engineers or chemical engineers deal with understand problems of climate change. So, using these we expand our own field and we are able to understand the environment in many different ways, and we also see that ordinary human beings do not just have very conventional or traditional or obsolete understandings of the environment, they are in fact using and deploying the knowledge of modern science in their interactions with the environment. So, this holistic idea of culture that we had actually expands to bring in modern science and how these are used by citizens, by NGOs, by the state and by scientists in addressing problems of climate change. Now, let us see if we can go into this in a little bit more depth and see how we can use this understanding of culture to deploy in pedagogic strategies in our classrooms. Now, Jessica Barnes and several others in an article in Nature Climate Change have identified 3 key ways in which social science disciplines like anthropology and sociology can contribute to climate studies. And here they are particularly talking about the anthropological or sociological understanding of culture when dealing with climate change. The first is something that is a very key part of sociology and anthropology as well as various other social science disciplines. This is the methodology of ethnography. So, ethnography is not only a set of techniques, ethnography is also an approach to understand society. So, ethnography gives us theory, ethnography gives us concepts, ethnography is also a set of methodological tools. And we all are already aware that intense long term field work is an essential aspect of ethnography. Now, the kind of insights that we gain using ethnographic techniques, how can this help us in doing research and teaching about climate change? One of the key ways that Barnes and others talk about is that climate change has expanded the anthropological lens of the ethnographic approach. So, ethnography was known for doing a lot of in-depth small scale studies, studying small groups, small societies, village level studies and so on. But with climate change we realize it is not adequate to gain an understanding of the problems posed by climate change by only looking at small scale groups and societies. And therefore, there are many more comparative studies that are being done. There is a tendency to scale up studies from a small group or a village in terms of trying to understand how this village is being affected by factors that are emerging from elsewhere, which may be thousands of kilometers away, horizontally or vertically. We are also able to understand cross scale kind of relationships, that is how the ability or inability of the state or of higher level regional authorities, provincial authorities, state governments, their ability or inability to deal with climate change, how it has micro level impacts on smaller groups. It could be a fishing village, it could be a farming village, it could be a group of pastoralists, nomadists and so on. As a part of this kind of a study, what teachers have started doing in the classroom in the social sciences is that they try to understand how cultural values and political relations influence climate related knowledge and interpretation. Why is it that very highly educated political leaders become climate deniers? Why is it that despite having knowledge about climate change related risks, politicians or bureaucrats do nothing? So, these kinds of political questions begin to be asked in the classroom, so that we are now able to move beyond the very conventional and narrow questions that children were taught in civics textbooks in the classroom, for example. At the same time, we can also use this kind of a knowledge to design better policies to adapt. So, by trying to understand what kind of policies actually work at the village level, we can then advise governments or NGOs, other kinds of organizations about what will work and what will not work. So, a lot of adaptation policies have just come from theory or have been transferred from other countries. Using ethnographic insights, we are in a better position to advise on what will work, what will not work. Another key insight from ethnography that we are getting through a lot of research is how knowledge about climate change, the scientific knowledge that is emerging, how these are circulated. For example, especially with social media, WhatsApp, Facebook and so on, there is knowledge being circulated. There is also a lot of fake news that gets circulated. There is a lot of obsolete news that gets circulated. So, it is possible that people get influenced by some of these fake news and therefore, they get into this panic mode. On the other hand, frequent circulation of fake and obsolete news can make people distrust genuine information and therefore, they get underprepared to deal with climate change related hazards. So, how information and knowledge regarding climate change gets circulated, how are they received by people, how are they used or deployed or misused. All of these help us come up with better coping and adaptation strategies to climate change. The second key way in which anthropology and sociology through an understanding of culture can help us better study and teach about climate change is the historical perspective. So, many of these social science disciplines have the advantage that they have been studying how human beings have dealt with the environment, how they have engaged with the environment, how they have suffered due to environmental degradation, how they have also become resilient to environmental changes. So, this historical context of climate debates helps us to put together a very robust body of knowledge about the history of coping, adapting to various kinds of environmental changes including climate change, about the history of vulnerability, who were vulnerable, why, when and in what way, and who were not vulnerable. Some of these studies, like the famous studies by Jared Diamond on how societies collapse, can be very useful in the classroom. So, Jared Diamond gives a lot of examples from history to talk about how some societies were culturally not equipped to deal with environmental degradation and climate change. Other societies came up with robust governance mechanisms and were able to work together instead of fighting with each other to deal with environmental challenges. So, these tell us why certain societies are more resilient and not others. So, in 2005, when a major flood hit Mumbai, for example, there were comparisons drawn with the impact of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, which occurred a few months later. While New Orleans was shut down for a couple of months, Mumbai came back on its feet within a matter of days. So, how is it that a society where a lot of people are supposed to be poor, where you do not have the modern technologies, where you do not have the well functioning, well oiled machine of disaster management like in Western countries, how is it that this kind of a city came back on its feet so soon, whereas a so called developed country, it took months before it could recover. So, these are examples which we could use in the classroom to talk about cultural differences that helps some societies to be much more resilient than others. Also, the historical perspective enables us to critique some of the past practices, because what we see is that very often governments, for many reasons including reasons of corruption, may choose particular options to deal with climate risks, even though we know they have failed in the past. So, historians, sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists have this advantage of using such failed examples from the past to critique current practices. Finally, Jessica Barnes and others also talk about how the social sciences enable us to bring a more holistic perspective. So, we know that the problem of climate change is not simply one of an external shock created by climate change, anthropogenic climate change on human societies. These are also related to changing forms of production and consumption. So, these are also about our own lifestyles, how we produce, how we consume. So, the holistic approach makes us realize that when climate change impacts societies, societies are forced to change their modes of production. So, in agriculture, for example, they will shift to, farmers will shift to different kinds of crops. What is the impact of this on livelihoods? What is the impact of this on labor? Who loses out on jobs? Are they men or women? Are they people of certain castes? Are they skilled people or unskilled people? How long are these shocks likely to last, in the short term or the long term? How do societies work together to address these shocks and stresses? For example, can schemes like the NREGA be used to help people cope with these kinds of stresses and shocks? Beyond immediate impacts, we are also slowly becoming aware that problems of migration and refugees also are to do with climate change. So, if there are frequent droughts, people tend to migrate out to other societies, other countries, to neighboring states. What kind of challenges do these create? What kind of problems do these create for societies to manage? So, economic systems and markets have to learn to cope with this additional influx of people. We have to create political institutions so that there is no bias or prejudice or conflicts or violence when this kind of migration and refugee influx happens. In all of these, a key input of social science disciplines is to bring in the issue of what kind of cultural meanings can be attached to climate change. So, is climate change only an environmental problem? Is it a social problem? Is it a political problem? What are the different kinds of knowledges we need to bring together to understand the various impacts of climate change? So, it is an enormous task, and so a holistic approach brought in by social sciences help us to address these different ways of understanding the climate change risks. Coming very specifically to teaching, what we see is that when we are talking about climate change and culture in the era of anthropogenic climate change, Susan Crate comes up with some very interesting suggestions here. One is the issue of scale, that is, if we are used to talking about very small scale societies, particular cities, particular societies, climate change forces us to change the scale at which we teach and do research. So, how to link the local and the global? Climate change offers excellent examples here. Okay. Also, how to look at a particular problem from the perspective of multiple stakeholders. So, if you are talking about a climate hazard, you need to bring in scientists, you need to bring in government officials, you need to bring in NGOs, you need to bring in disaster management agencies and ordinary people also. So, by force we are made to adopt interdisciplinary approaches. So, in this way the cultural dimension and climate change can be brought together in very innovative ways in the classroom. The issue of methodology also is very interesting and exciting at the same time. So, this term climate ethnography has been coined to refer to how climate change can be understood not simply from the knowledge produced by scientists, but by ordinary people also. So, there are very interesting studies around the world about how indigenous people living in forests have a much better or much more accurate methods of forecasting extreme events, whether these are cyclones or heat waves or droughts. So, these can be used to make climate science itself more holistic and give further agendas for climate scientists to do research on. So, this is the term that is used here is co-production of knowledge or hybrid knowledge. So, you can engage in critical collaboration where ordinary people, whether these are farmers or fishers or people dependent on forests, can work with scientists to produce new kinds of knowledge. We also try to understand from this perspective of climate ethnography how climate is understood by people which may be very different from how scientists understand this. And therefore, climate change creates new kinds of demands on us, because on the one hand knowledge is constantly shifting. So, how can we teach our own different subjects in a context where now knowledge is shifting so fast, especially when it comes to environment and climate change. At the same time, climate change creates new kinds of inequalities. So, people who were well off, who had higher incomes, higher social status, may be very adversely affected by climate change related risks. So, how our understanding of existing concepts related to inequalities itself changes. Okay. So, these are new kinds, new directions in which social sciences can move. So, these are all different areas for teaching and research that are identified by Susan Crate, including some of the cultural orientations and symbolic frameworks. For example, we know that human beings attach sacred meanings to aspects of nature, whether this is lightning or rivers or glaciers or mountains and so on. How do these change and how do these affect identities of people, and do these force more ordinary citizens to take an interest in climate change and try to mitigate the impacts of climate change? Okay. So, these are all new areas that can be brought into the classroom. Also, Neil Adger is one of the most famous and well known researchers on climate change. He and some of his colleagues talk about how culture as a concept and as a phenomena, as a set of phenomena, can mediate society's responses to climate change and risks. So, for example, if a very important temple gets washed away in a cloudburst, what does it do to the identity of the people for whom that particular temple is very important? What does it do to their identity? What if forests degrade? What if biodiversity disappears and many important species that are regarded as sacred for people disappear? If there is sea level rise and entire fishing village is submerged, what does it do to their idea of space? Because they have grown up thinking about space as the interface between the sea and the land. If they are forced to move more inland, what does it do to their own ways of living and surviving and livelihoods and coping with the changes that they are forced to adjust to? So, how do people even adjust to risk? So, there are issues related to beliefs, to rituals, to art, to stories. So, all of these give us new material to work on, both in teaching and in research. So, just as we looked at all these issues related to beliefs and rituals and art in our classroom in these subjects, we can also bring in climate change related beliefs and rituals and meanings, so that on the one hand we are making students sensitive to climate change, on the other hand we also are able to expand our own subjects by bringing in these new examples. So, some examples are given in this particular slide about how there are specific kinds of biological and physical impacts which translate into different kinds of cultural impacts. So, one interesting exercise that you could do in the classroom is to make your students collect these kinds of examples in the areas in which you are located. That makes them much more engaged with their communities, but also better understand the impacts of climate change on culture. Finally, we look at the issue of religion, which is one of the most important cultural aspects of all societies. So, it is very interesting that many religious groups have come together to give serious attention to climate change. The present Pope Francis, for example, has issued what is called as an encyclical in the year 2015, where he is not just talking about how climate change can adversely impact human beings, but he is in fact asking a very fundamental question: what does it mean to be human? To be human means to live with dignity. To be human means to be responsible to other people. To be human means to have a purpose in life, both for ourselves and for others. So, climate change threatens all three of these. Okay? How religion can then become a cultural resource for us to deal with climate change, apart from technology and scientific knowledge and so on. So, in this sense, climate change is being posed as a moral problem. And this is because we are saying that the problem of anthropogenic climate change, its impacts, it has its origins in culture. That is, it has its origins in our attitude towards nature, it has its attitudes in our attitudes towards lifestyle, towards technology, towards production, towards the economy, towards profits. It is a cultural problem. Therefore, the solution also has to come from culture. Religion can perhaps play a very important role in this, but maybe other aspects of culture can also play a very important role in this. Historically, religion has always been very important in influencing human relationship to environment, and it will be so when it comes to challenges posed by climate change as well. And therefore, we will end this part of the module on this point, that the importance of culture can be brought into the classroom in teaching various subjects by talking about the cultural origins of anthropogenic climate change and the cultural imperative of developing solutions to climate change. So, let me stop here and we will take up the political aspects of the social dynamics of climate change in the second part of this module.